Hey guys, Coach Pop here. Thanks for joining me for the video cast for today. Today is lesson 3.1. This is the first lesson in the Classical Empires, chapter 3. The key concept for the week is the development of states and empires. So let's go ahead and jump in. What exactly are we talking about here? Well, you'll remember that a state is a centralized political authority from last week. That is to say, it has a centralized leader, it has a system of some sort of bureaucracy to administer the state. Most of the early states that we have seen are kingdoms. Kings, remember, rule by coercion. That is to say, by force or by threat of force. If you don't follow the rules, you will be punished. That's how kings get their power, as opposed to a chief who rules by charisma. He gets people to like him, so they want to follow him. A new term, though, that we're going to use a lot is sovereignty. That is the power to control your land without interference from somebody else. So a state has the power to rule over its territory. It has a kind of monopoly on that power, where whether that power comes from coercion or charisma, they have that authority to rule in their particular territory. But then the question is, so how is that different from an empire? Not all states are empires. So what's going on here? Well, the definition that we're going to use comes from a guy named Robert Strayer, and he defines it this way: an empire is a larger, more aggressive state that first of all conquers other states. That is a fundamental aspect of any empire, that you conquer other states. Then, using their natural resources, you're not just conquering them just to say you rule over them. There's resources there that you will then use as part of your imperial project. When conquering all of these people, though, you will eventually end up with a whole bunch of different people who speak different languages, have different belief systems, have different customs, a multi-ethnic society. All of these different people are now within your territory, and so you have to find a way to rule over them through a common political system. How do you manage uh, ruling over such a diverse group of people? That is a fundamental challenge that successful empires are going to have to figure out how to do. So, if that's our definition, one of the reason number 7,000 why English is a weird language, this word imperialism, meaning the process of becoming an empire, it's not imperialism. I don't, English is weird that way. But so if the definition that Strayer gives us, that's our working definition for the rest of the year. There's other questions though about how and why empires develop the way that they do, or why do some succeed and others do not. So, given our definition, that's a start. But in order to address the more difficult questions, we're going to use the Conrad-Demarest model to help us understand this. Now, full disclosure, Arthur Demarest, who's one of the two scholars who came up with this idea, was a teacher of mine at Vanderbilt, so I'm totally biased. The other thing is, though, the way that he teaches it in a college class, it was an anthropology class, in fact, that I had with him, it was far more complex than the way that I'm presenting it to you. I'm trying to simplify it to make it easier for us to actually apply it. So here's the thing about the Conrad-Demarest model. Okay, it's attempting to describe how imperialism works. And he breaks it down into three stages. First, the preconditions for imperialism. In other words, these are the things that have to be in place for a state to become an empire. First, you have to start with a state level government. Almost always it starts with a kingdom, and you have to have some sort of military power. if conquering other states is a key feature of being an empire, you have to have the military resources in order to do that. Second precondition is a power vacuum. And if you think of space as a vacuum, there's literally nothing there. And so if anything comes in, it rushes in and sort of fills that empty space. In terms of states and empires, what we're talking about is there's a whole bunch of states there and maybe fighting with each other, and some might have power briefly, but they can't control it. They can't maintain it. There's not a single state controlling all of the other states. That's the power vacuum that must exist before an empire can rise. And finally, an environmental mosaic, and that's a word that the authors of this model use, the mosaic, a bunch of different resources. Now, either you have those resources to begin with, or you get access to them through conquest. That could be farmland, that could be access to iron ore, for example, or it could be access to trade routes, which then give you access to resources far beyond your realm. So those are the preconditions, but then once your state becomes an empire, why do some empires succeed and others quickly crumble? So the conditions for success are first an ideology that connects individuals with the imperial system. Now, this term ideology is one we're going to use a lot, and it's rather complicated. For right now, though, what I want you to focus on is the second part of that. An ideology is an idea. It could be a religion, it could be something else, and we'll see various examples throughout the rest of the week. But the key is it connects individuals with the imperial system. In other words, there's some sort of idea that people believe that when the empire is growing and succeeding, that they personally benefit from that, that they are part of this larger process that is not only beneficial, but from their perspective, actually good. Second, you have to have an effective bureaucracy. This is, of course, a term that we used last week, and we're going to use it a whole lot more throughout the rest of the year. You have to have some sort of system of people who are actually administering the power of the state over this large territory that somehow does develop a sense of common good, that it's not just a few people who are benefiting, but the idea is that all of the people of the empire benefit from it. And third, territorial expansion that provides economic benefits. Expansion in and of itself is cool, but there has to be some sort of reward for that. One other thing that we'll see, though, is that idea of territorial expansion, like does that just go on forever? Do you just constantly have to keep conquering more people? That's an issue we'll come back later on, but the economic benefits of that expansion, first of all, has to support continued population growth. Empires succeed, obviously, when their people get enough food to survive, and then they have more children and so on and so forth. But that wealth also, in if it's going to work, it has to trickle down. The social hierarchy simulation, which I do every year, we didn't get to do it this year, but the idea is that some of that wealth, some of the economic benefits are supposed to reach down to every level of society. And if they do, that's generally considered a success. However, no matter how great an empire is, every single empire in history will eventually fall. Every single one. So what's going on there? Well, empires fall, first of all, when they just get too freaking big. It happens over and over again. They just expand so much that they literally cannot control everything. Overexpansion is a recurring idea. Similarly, internal problems will start to erode and change the success of an empire over time, including a failure of leadership. That is to say, the elites who are supposed to be doing good, things for the public good start doing it for their own benefit. For example, we call that corruption, when the people in charge are not doing what they're supposed to do for the good of the state, instead doing it for their personal benefit. And then an erosion of ideology. Similarly, when people stop believing that they are part of this really important system, then they don't care anymore, and they're going to try to overthrow that system. We call those rebellions, or if they succeed in overthrowing the system, we call them revolutions. But there's also external problems that can contribute. In many cases, as we will see, this idea that goes back to the first wave, the core civilizations of us versus them, and they are barbarians and we're the civilized people. When those so-called barbarians start attacking, sometimes, not always, they can contribute to weakening the empire. And another one that appears frequently is epidemic disease. If your empire is expanding so big and it's coming in contact with other empires and other civilizations, that contributes to the spread of epidemic disease, and that can in turn weaken your empire. Okay, so we're going to look more closely at this model in class tomorrow, but I just want to give you the sort of broad strokes of that. I want to lay out a little bit about how this is going to work for the rest of the year. Imperial societies is a term that we're going to use. There's a lesson we're not going to be able to get into because of the current COVID situation. But the basic idea is this. We start with the Persian Empire. And I use the term the fulcrum of classical imperial societies. It's kind of not just geographically in the center, but because it's the first classical empire, it serves as a model for many other imperial societies to come. For the remainder of this week, the focus of what we do in class will involve the West. If Persia is the center, to the west of Persia, and the reason for that primarily is because there are a lot of things that happen in very similar ways. In Greece, for example, the process of Alexander the Great ending up conquering Persia and then spreading Greek culture all over has some very similar patterns to Persia. Rome as well, which starts off as a republic, a relatively small city-state and surrounding area, ends up becoming this giant empire, initiating this period called the Pax Romana, which we'll talk about more later in the week, of Roman peace, where it's just spreading all the benefits to everybody around. To the east of Persia, though, things happen a little differently, and you're going to be introduced to these this week, but we're going to look at them much more closely next week when we start to get into the notion of religions and philosophies, because they seem to have a much more direct impact with the Eastern empires. In South Asia, for example, the pattern there is they have local kingdoms, a bunch of local kingdoms, and every once in a while they're all brought together under an empire, but then they go back to being local kingdoms. In other words, the pattern in South Asia is that there's an empire intermittently, is a word that we're going to use quite a lot. It happens every once in a while, but it's not the norm. On the other hand, in East Asia, after the establishment of the first empire, the notion that China should be an empire will continue for thousands and thousands of years. It's just assumed that it's so. The only thing that changes from their perspective is the dynasties will change over time. But so the pattern in China, very different from South Asia. Okay, so let's take a look then. How exactly did we get to empires anyways? And as with most things, to figure out where's the first anything, a good place to start is in Mesopotamia. And in Mesopotamia, you'll remember that civilization was started by the Sumerians. Now, the Sumerians, remember, we're not exactly sure who these people were. They set up the first cities ever in the world in this area in the southern part of Mesopotamia called Sumer, where the Sumerians were. And again, we already know this. They're the first civilization. They are the first city states. But if you take a look at it, those city states, each city is a separate kingdom, a separate state. And even though they all speak the same language, they all use cuneiform, they all worship the same gods, their polytheistic beliefs, they think of themselves as separate nations. Like they think of, if you live in Kish, for example, you think of yourself as separate from the people who live in Uruk, for example, even though culturally you're almost exactly the same. It's rather like, you know, Canadians and U.S. Americans, you know, speaking the same language. Like there's very different, very small differences, but we think of ourselves as a separate nation, even though they're states. Now, there's dozens of cities. These were just four of the earliest ones that appeared in Sumer. However, you will notice after that, all of these city-states up in the northern part of Mesopotamia were inhabited by Semites who moved in and simply copied everything that the Sumerians did, literally everything, their gods, their writing system, their city-states, until this one guy, the king of Akkad, Sargon was his name, he looks around and he's like, hey, I've got this really strong army, and I think I could go in there and start knocking over the city states in Sumer. And so that's what he does. One by one, he just starts conquering city states. And then he heads out and conquers the city states in the north. And he ends up creating the world's first empire. But here's what I want you to notice, and this goes back to an item on your outline above. There's something fundamentally different about the geography of Mesopotamia. Why did the first empire appear in Mesopotamia and not in Egypt? Well, because in Egypt, after Menes the First, who's the first pharaoh who unites Lower Egypt and Upper Egypt, things sort of stay the same for long periods of time, and there's a geographical reason for it. You got desert over here, you've got water, you've got water, you've got desert. Like Egypt is very well insulated from any sort of threat from outside. On the other hand, in Mesopotamia, you have all of these competing city-states creating a power vacuum, and into that vacuum then, once somebody comes up with the idea and has the military resources to do it, the first empire becomes established. Now, after the Akkadians, another Semitic group, the Babylonians will take over, and you'll remember our man Hammurabi, who's the king of Babylon, and he sees that the situation is everybody's weak, there's no one really in charge, he's got a strong army, so he starts conquering the city-states around him, then starts expanding and conquering other city-states and getting larger and larger and larger, until the blue line here is the height of the Babylonian Empire, just right after Hammurabi. But then, like no one could hold control in Mesopotamia for a particular long period of time. We get these waves of empires. We get like Hittites who are Indo-Europeans, the Elamites who are down here. We don't even know where they came from. They for a while hold control, and there's like constantly different people trying to make an empire in Mesopotamia, and they'll succeed briefly, but it doesn't last very long. They are the last of those, though. The Neo-Assyrians, which is the largest of the empires in Mesopotamia, which you can see is so large it even includes Egypt. One of their key leaders is a dude named Assurbanipal, who I just like to say the name Assurbanipal because it's so cool. He is from the city Assur. Again, he's a Semite, but he's been copying all the Sumerian ways of doing things. One of the things that he does once Hammurabi establishes a legal code to try to keep this empire together, a twist for Assurbanipal, though, is that he creates the world's first great library at Nineveh. And the idea there was he was trying to collect all of the knowledge of all of the peoples within Mesopotamia and then later Egypt as well, to try to create this like unified base of culture. So it was an attempt to try to keep his empire together, but it doesn't work for very long. And then eventually we get a Neo-Babylonian empire, Neo meaning new. That's the one that's in green up here. A guy that, by the way, Babylon is down here. King of Babylon, Nebuchadnezzar, who starts conquering other city-states to build his empire, nonetheless continuing doing everything the way the Sumerians did. He is also sort of remembered in the Old Testament, if you've read it, for two things. Number one, that he's the one that enslaves a bunch of Hebrews and destroys the temple in Jerusalem. The other one, though, is he's the guy that created the Hanging Gardens of Babylon. The Hanging Gardens, one of the great wonders of the ancient world, was designed to project his power as a way to try to keep his empire together. Like, he builds this thing that is so fabulous that anybody who sees it or hears about it goes, wow, that guy must be really powerful. Of course, it doesn't last forever because all empires fall, but that, excuse me, that takes us to the classical period. The first of the classical empires is Persia. And I have on the slide Persian empires because there's a bunch of different dynasties, but sort of the prototype is established by Cyrus the Great, known as the Achaemenid dynasty. So this is a family line of rulers, the Achaemenid dynasty or Achaemenids, who really sort of set the pattern, not just for Persian empires, but for all empires afterwards. So Cyrus the Great was the king of Persepolis down here, and he begins conquering other kingdoms around him until he eventually moves into Mesopotamia, where, again, there's been empires, but no one seems to be able to hold on to them very long, conquers all of that. But then, in an interesting sort of twist, he uses cuneiform to write all the official documents. So even as he conquers Mesopotamia, they borrow certain things, namely the cuneiform system. But in terms of religion, he practices a very different belief system than the polytheism of Mesopotamia, called Zoroastrianism, which we'll definitely go into more detail next week when we get into religions, but we'll also look more closely at it tomorrow because that serves as a kind of ideology to keep people together. Nonetheless, he does tolerate the local beliefs of his conquered people. The area in this map, like, so here's where he started. He conquers, and then he goes, the dark green is all the territory that Cyrus the Great conquers. It's huge. Like, it's way bigger than any of the empires that were in Mesopotamia, right? Much larger. So that's a big feature that's different about classical empires. They're just bigger. Now, he will eventually be succeeded by Cyrus the Great, who will not only extend the empire, conquering Egypt, which is a huge deal there, but extending it eastward as well towards the Indus Valley. But the thing about Darius is he is the guy who sort of cements and comes up with a way to administer this empire. This empire is so big, like no one really knows. How are you supposed to govern something so big with so many different ethnic groups in it? And the way he does it is he comes up with this system called the satrapy system. On this map, all of the terms in capital letters are satraps. And we'll talk much more tomorrow in class examining how this works because it's rather complex. But the basic idea is this. From here on out, the leader of the Persian Empire takes the title King of Kings. And that's deliberate because the local king was allowed to stay in power so long as he followed the directions of a Persian guy who's kind of like a governor called a satrap. One of the key features of that, though, is not just do you have to pay taxes and all of that, there's this very symbolic ritual that's involved where the King of Kings is recognized in Persepolis. This is the ruins of the main receiving hall in Persepolis. Every king had to send an emissary to Persepolis bearing gifts. Now, they're not gifts that are valuable like in terms of silver or gold. That's what taxes were for. These were symbolic gifts. Like, what is the thing that your region is most known for? This is a carving on one side of the wall, and you can see all these different people who are dressed differently. They're clearly from different regions, and they're all carrying these gifts. But here's how this whole process works. The King of Kings has this parade through the streets of Persepolis. And you can imagine all of the Persians in the city lining the streets, and they see all these people from all of these conquered kingdoms walking through the streets and then carrying these gifts. And when they get to the main chamber, they go up the steps, and the King of Kings is sitting up on high, and they all bow down and offer him gifts one after another after another. So the sort of purpose of this politically is it's projecting the power. The King of Kings. He's not just the king of Persepolis, he is the King of Kings. And everybody goes, wow, look at all those people bowing down, and he must be a powerful dude. Again, we'll look much more closely at this later on because it is a rather complex system, but this is the system Darius sort of solidifies, and it works for a while. It's a way to keep that empire together through a common political system, the satrapy system. Now, the Achaemenids, however, do not last forever. They will eventually be conquered by Alexander the Great. We'll look at that much more closely in the next couple of days. There are a couple other dynasties, though, that you need to just be aware of. No dynasty will ever be as great as the Achaemenids. However, the Seleucids, who are actually not Persian. They're the descendants of Alexander the Great's generals. So they're Greeks who rule in Persia after Alexander the Great. But what is unusual is even though they're spreading Greek language and culture, politically they're still using the satrapy system. In other words, they keep the exact same administration system that the Achaemenids have. In this map, this is the Seleucids, again, the Greek rulers in Persia. I want you to notice a couple of things. Here's Persepolis down here, the main capital. There's a satrapy up here called Parthia. These people, by the way, these are modern nations. This is a region in modern Iran. And they think of themselves as Iranians. They're not Greeks. And so they will eventually become the next dynasty to form a Persian empire. Now, if you look at the dates here, you'll notice it overlaps quite a bit because they had a king who was supposed to be following the Seleucid king of kings, but over time they start to resist that more and more until eventually they overthrow the Seleucids. So the idea there is they're saying, well, we're getting rid of the Greek rule. We want our people to be ruling, although they are from the northern part of Iran, and their empire is, the Persian heartland. It's a pretty significant empire for a while, but they will eventually be replaced by the third dynasty after the Achaemenids, the Sassanids. Now they claim they're descendants of the Achaemenids. The Parthenids were Iranian, they were Persian, but they were not from that same family line. And so the Sassanids take over, and they're like on a make Persia great again campaign. They're like, let's go back to the way the Achaemenids were. Now, part of that includes the Zoroastrian religion, because throughout all of this time, Greek philosophy was spreading since the time of the Greek rules. But there's a trick to that, which we'll talk more about later on. The Sassanids, though, do expand the territory of the Persian Empire at the end. But if you look at the dates, you will notice this is about the time that Islam begins to arise. And so the Sassanid dynasty, while not so great as the Achaemenid, it's important because they're going to come into conflict both with what was left of Rome and also with a rising Islamic system in the next unit that we get to, the post-classical era. Here's the thing I want you to know. When we talk about Persia, 90% of the time, we're talking about the Achaemenid dynasty. Okay? Those other dynasties, like you will see them on maps sometimes or referenced to, like when the Roman Empire is fighting against Persia, it might be one of those. But the big idea here is, by and large, Persia equals the Achaemenids. Okay, so I hope you were able to fill in the outline. There's a lot of stuff there that you didn't have to fill in, and there's a reason for that, and that is your focus questions. First, and so use the outline to answer those questions. The first question involves the definition of empire according to Robert Strayer. There's a question about the Conrad-Demarest model. One thing that you need to be able to recognize is where these places are. So there's a map that you've got to label there. And then on the second page or the back, if you did it double-sided, looking at continuity in change in the development of imperialism. Okay, so from the time of Sargon Akkad up through the Persian empires, like what changes and what stays the same, and then looking at how the Achaemenids added their own twists to this in significant ways, but then there's still a couple of things that they continue from Mesopotamia. The activity that we're doing in class, it will be on Schoology, but there's not a whole lot that you need to print out. You definitely need to have the outline completed with you, though. What we're going to do is look much more closely at what the Persians were up to, but sort of filtering it through the Conrad-Demarest model. In other words, if the Conrad-Demarest model says this is how imperialism works, does that actually apply with Persia? Does it actually explain what happens there? That's what we're going to be doing in class. I thank you for your attention, and I look forward to seeing you in class. Have a great day.